Andrea, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with you about the digital score and some alternative ways of thinking about it and looking for it. We've had a little preliminary chat, and I've kind of preloaded a question with you. But I think one of the first things that is important to for the listeners and for us to think about is to have a brief notion of what your 4Es concept means.
Yes, thank you, Craig. Well, first of all, it's not my concept. I borrow it from scholars from the cognitive sciences and in philosophy who have been using this idea to kind of look at mental life from a different perspective. And I refer particularly to scholars like Sean Gallagher or Ivan Thompson and others. And I try to apply these theoretical tools to music to understand better music cognition and music making in general. So the main idea, again, following this research in other domains, is that we could understand mental life, so our ability to think, to feel, to communicate, but also to make music, for example, within 4 different perspectives, let's say. We could understand mental life as being embodied, embedded, extended, and inactive. And I will try to kind of give you a very one-sentence view over these 4Es, even if, of course, a deeper discussion would be required to kind of get the full spectrum of ideas that it involves. So when we say that the mind is embodied, we basically think that the body itself plays an important role in shaping mental life, so in shaping how we think, how we communicate with others. So everything that we think, that we do in a way, is not separated from our bodily power of action and from the body itself and how it relates to the environment. And this is also an important part of the idea that the mind is also embedded. So the social and cultural environment in which we are situated shapes how we think and how we develop, both ontogenetically and phylogenetically. Again, there is no hard separation between ourself and the world that we inhabit. And when we look more concretely at the mechanisms in which this relationship develops, then we could also look at the mind through the lens of extended mind. For example, how exactly we can use some of the tools of the environment to offload some of the mental content that we have. So, for example, how we can how the technologies and devices, representation systems from the environment can help us, for example, facilitate certain tasks that perhaps can be too cognitively difficult for us to do. And finally, with regard to the idea of inactive cognition, I borrow words from Ivan Thompson, who says that the idea that the mind is embodied, embedded, and extended can be summarized as with the idea that the mind is inactive. So that indeed we are, the mind can be understood as situated action that plays out in a meaningful environment, and we seek for the sort of aspects of the world that we could resonate with and that we could shape in a sort of in and out relationship. So there's always a dynamical two-way relationship between ourselves and the world, and the idea that the mind is inactive aims to capture such a dynamical relationship. So I hope I gave you a very brief overview of these ideas, but yeah.
Absolutely. I think it's immensely helpful and really insightful and truly valuable in understanding what's really going on. What Christopher Small says, what's going on here? When we try to talk about the meaning making that happens in musicking, the creative acts of music, it seems that this is a very important gateway into opening out some of those ways of thinking about the different layers and different dimensions that are always happening at the same time, but perhaps aren't always happening, you know, as you know, kind of at the forefront of our mind or of our action. And so do you think that those 4 E's, they help us understand what's going on inside music, or is it from the outside perspective, looking and observing and analyzing, you know, kind of the musical acts?
I think it can go both ways. I think that the 4 E's and, for example, the embodied perspective really help us understand from a novel perspective, perhaps from a richer perspective, how much people can engage with music, and how often they use more than just the brain to kind of resonate with music, participate in musical activities. And this, I think, has important consequences for our understanding of music, but also from our understanding of cognition. So it goes in 2 different ways. We could either discover more about music itself, and we could discover more about human cognition as well, using music as a tool to access such a domain. And so I think that it is a very useful tool, and it goes particularly well also with the digital scores. And perhaps we could move to this part of the discussion as well, which I'm really looking forward to.
Indeed, that was my next my next point, was to in a previous discussion, so in a pre-meet, you identified 3 key areas, having read the book, that you wanted to question me about, or, you know, kind of open up the questions. So do you want to start? Do you want to kick us off with one of those, the first one of those?
Yeah, of course. So the idea is that after reading the book, I've identified 3 main focal points that I found particularly fascinating, because they can inspire richer understandings of digital technologies in music, how digital scores can be understood, but also they extend to include other areas as well, such as music education, for example, or music cognition, as we just started to discuss. And very briefly, these 3 focal points can be understood as, you know, normativity. So the kind of what kind of action can be designated to be permissible or not within the context of digital scores, but also the augmentation and possible decrease of human presence by using the scores, digital scores, sorry. And finally, the here and now engagement that's, you know, that kind of permeates our engagement with music, or our performances practice, let's say, in music. So perhaps if I can briefly introduce the first one, the idea of normativity, I'd say that, you know, what I found particularly fascinating while reading your book is that I kind of feel like there is a sort of nice ambiguity here when it comes to normativity. So on the one hand, digital scores allow for more actions to be under control, more people to be involved, but at the same time, the very nature of such actions are somehow more ineffable and probably more difficult to capture when compared to traditional scores. And I think this is a very interesting part of it, how to navigate this ambiguity and kind of, you know, go through these different poles. And this probably is a resource of digital scores, rather than a sort of a difficulty or something hard to understand. What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's a real positive feature that digital and interactive technologies can enable these different ways, different, you know, kind of ambiguous languages, ambiguous ways of dealing with it, ambiguous ways of communicating ideas between the minds of musicians. I've stopped calling them composers and performers. You know, we're all just musicians. And I think that kind of gets to the heart of the stuff that I'm particularly interested in. You know, I was taught by Gavin Bryars and the whole kind of post-British experimental form of music, and which himself was inspired by Cage and Earl Brown and Morton Feldman. And so the score for me is less a dictatorship, a sequence from left to right that you play in a certain sequence. Now, of course, that brings within it an awful lot of personal and subjective aesthetics and choice from the realizing performer. But at the same time, I think there are, and has been for many decades now, an interest in the musician who is realizing it, and bringing them and asking them to make decisions and considerations and help. You know, I mean, we can talk about Umberto Eco's notion of the open work, you know, to help complete the work. Of course, it's never completed until another pair of ears is listening to it. Let's call them the audience. But yeah, I think it augments that and really emphasizes and extends that opportunity for composers, originating musicians, to give other musicians an opportunity, much like a game, of a different way of contributing to a musicking experience. Did I understand that correctly?
Yes, yes, and I'm so thankful for your answer, because it really also connects well to the second point that I would like to draw your attention on, which is that of human presence. And you already anticipated the main point here, and I think it's really worth to kind of go again into detail about it, because again, there is a sort of ambiguity here, but again, in the positive sense of the word, obviously, which, so on the one hand, again, digital scores seem to augment the human presence in musicking, because there are more people involved. There is all sort of new relationships that develop, that are created through digital scores, which, you know, the presence of the composer is one, for as an example, you know, that is much more often required than in traditional scores. But on the other hand, I learned while reading the book that sometimes digital scores also offer or feature, let's say, algorithms that can be self-organizing in a way, so that they are in a sense independent from human action, in a limited sense at least. And so this, I think, is another sort of nice paradox, because on the one hand, it seems that human presence is augmented, but on the other, it seems that also is more limited, or perhaps it decreases, given the complementary role of technologies. And so I wonder how you would see this, again, this fine line between human presence and technology.
Well, I think you're right. This is a really important part of understanding the meaning making in the digital score, is the nature of all of the presences and the relationships that are in there. And for me, it kind of comes out of an interest in gaming and an interest in, you know, kind of non-player characters, but also an understanding of a kind of flat ontology, where the presence of the human doesn't have any greater hierarchy than that of some of the operational intelligent agents that are inside a game or, you know, a digital score. But I think it's worth riffing around this a little bit more, and I'd really like, I mean, people can read my opinion about it because it's in the book there, but what I'd like to do is kind of is to understand from your perspective some of the nuances here within presence, because it clearly does disrupt a given hierarchy, perhaps a romantic or, you know, kind of classical hierarchy of composer. You know, the presence of the composer is embedded in the dots, in the piece of paper, in the handwriting. So how do you think that digital scores disrupt that from the nature of presences?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think there is a renegotiation of roles and responsibility that is really high important. And really, this particular aspect really resonated with me, because I've been interested into this particular view from a perspective of music education. So how, for example, we could renegotiate the roles of learners when they learn together, and how we can give them more responsibility to kind of, you know, explore novel things throughout their musical journey by themselves, through exploration rather than through, you know, revealment of content from a teacher. Sorry for my bad English, but
That's right.
but yeah. So the idea would be, I think, the main point that I get from your book is that there is an important renegotiation of roles and responsibilities that, you know, sort of goes on and continuously reshapes itself through the digital scores and through the kind of all the technologies that are involved into it. So there is a continuous change that makes, I think, that creates a new set of relationships. So one important part of your book is the, in my opinion, is how you define the digital scores as a sort of we can define them through the relationships that they instantiate with performers, composers, and others. And I think that this is really the key to kind of to look into that. So how, what kind of relationships are formed, and how do they develop through time, through space, through cultures? And I think this sort of renegotiations of role and responsibilities is one of the many forms that take shape.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about, we have a very keen interest in the condition of, you know, kind of 21st century education, music education in higher education. And, you know, there's still a classical model being imposed through that. I mean, there's centres of excellence where that doesn't happen, and thankfully it's kind of broadening out. But there still is the model where there is a composer, and they are very different to performers, and the score goes from one to the other. Whereas in fact, what I'm trying to propagate or to renegotiate or disrupt is the fact that we're all musicians. Yeah, I know I use the term composer and performer, and in the second edition I will iron that out. But there is a renegotiation here between actually what the intention of the originating musician is. If it is to instruct strictly, you just replay this, then fine, that's okay. But actually, I think with digital technologies, gaming, computation, AI, there's a different way now that actually we could accept that actually we set up an environment for a musician to excel, another person to excel, and accept what they do, and to somehow use AI, generative, autonomous ways of thinking in order to progress their journeys through that world and through those acceptance parameters. And I think that is very different. It's very different to get your head around, because I don't know what it's like in Austria or in Italy, and you've taught in other countries as well around the world, whether or not you feel that there is still this classical model of a strict hierarchy, and what perhaps the problems that brings.
Yeah, certainly. This is a central problem, a central issue, an object of study in music education. And there are very different perspectives on that. On the one hand, for example, one-to-one modes of instructions have their advantages. But on the other, of course, they kind of reinforce this traditional view, this traditional hierarchical view, where there is a teacher who is the one who has knowledge, which can transfer it to a learner, which is sort of an empty vessel that has to be filled with knowledge, and therefore, you know, this creates problems. And if we think back to the Fourie view of mind, then probably we may not be so keen to accept this idea of knowledge transfer between someone who knows things and someone who doesn't. Whereas, you know, I see this relationship as much more dynamical and involving other aspects such as the environment, culture, you know, the drive that moves the learner to explore the world, and therefore become more responsible also for their own learning. So I think for just one example of that is a recent qualitative study that we have been conducting, where we asked teachers to identify some differences between teaching one-to-one and teaching groups of students. And we found that one of the difference that they highlighted, of course, given the limited sample of qualitative study, was the idea of presence and responsibility. So when teachers sometimes step back and give more responsibilities to students when they teach in groups, when they are more learners at the same time, therefore, again, renegotiating the roles, giving more responsibility to some, having, you know, a mixture of things that kind of disrupts, as you say, this sort of linear model of knowledge transfer. And I think this is really an important advantage that digital scores can offer as well.
So yes, that was my next question, is do you see a role, given the broad scope and general definition of a digital score, do you see that fitting into this disruption process in a positive way? Because, well, you tell me if you do, and then explain why.
I think so. I think it does. I think there is I mean, it really aligns with this idea of giving more responsibility to learners in a different way, in a less prescriptive way. at the same time enhancing presence and relationships with technology. So there is a sort, again, this two-way ambiguity. I think it plays out very well, very nicely here, because it kind of gives an opportunity to students to reflect on themselves as learners, to kind of instantiate novel relationships with others, to generate novel and perhaps foster and enhance their own creativity through technology. So I think it is really a valuable resource that can be used in educational settings. And there has been a lot of discussion recently also in music education with regard to how technology can be used in education, and particularly in the last 2 years with the pandemic. Of course, online teaching has been sort of an important topic to discuss, and perhaps this can go in the same direction, kind of giving more opportunity for us as scholars to reflect on the role of technologies.
But do you think that the nature of presence and the multifarious opportunities to embed or enact presence within a digital score as an operational other, do you think that is a key element here? That's a key feature?
Yes, I mean, because it kind of it gives us, so from a theoretical perspective, it helps us kind of step back and reflect on what is meant by being there, and for example, engage with technology. So it gives us a framework to kind of look at this ways of engaging with music in a way. But from a more kind of educational perspective, perhaps it really kind of goes in the same way. It follows very closely the idea of renegotiating roles and offering a more, perhaps a less hierarchical way of teaching and learning. And I think this is really a positive feature of it.
I'm aware of time, and we have some left, of course, and there is a third dimension that you want to discuss, which was the nature of here and now. And it sounds like this would be a good one, because you've already done the stepping stone for us to discuss. Do you want to launch into that one?
Yes, I will try to cover it too quickly, and because also it really this idea of here and now engagement with music kind of stems clearly from the other two aspects, that of normativity and human presence. And the idea is that again, there is this nice ambiguity that's kind of really fascinated me while reading the book, between how digital scores are often taught for specific musicians, specific ensembles, specific composers, or even specific places and time where the performance would take place. But at the same time, technologies allow for more kind of for different ways of engaging with music. So they are temporarily extended. There was a passage in your book, which now I cannot remember, unfortunately, where you talk about a journey of sounds that digital scores would allow to go for even before of a performance. So the idea of, again, on the one hand, the specificity of the digital scores related to specific musicians places a good emphasis on the here and now of musical engagement. But again, this sort of the very nature of technology also kind of permits sort of novel ways of engaging with music that are more temporally extended. So again, this is the other ambiguity that I wanted to discuss with you.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point that you highlighted those, because I think that is one of the defining features. It's what with interactivity is that digital technologies allow, facilitate or stimulate these truly meaningful relationships in the here and now, whereas the technologies of the Gutenberg printing press didn't quite allow that. It did on a metaphysical level. You are interacting with the composer. There is an example of the Borromeo quartet talking about them playing to a Beethoven, the handwritten score of Beethoven, through digital technology, and that for me was really signaled something that there is something special. So there's something more than just the notes coming off the page at that point. So that aside, actually, what do we have in the world at the moment? You know, there's interactivity, there's gaming. That is a big feature. I've been gaming since I was 12 years old when I first got my ZX Spectrum and learning to code on it in BASIC as well. You know, and you know, I'm in my 50s. I see my kids learning to program in Unity at school and do robotics. So that's that's embedded in our culture and our life, and I don't think we can get away from it. It also means that the conversations, the connections that composers or one musician can afford to another musician without them even being there, you know, that somehow we can embed on a kind of blue sky way of thinking, we can embed nature, our own nature, into the operational significance of a digital score, so that in a sense our presence is felt beyond the you know, the kind of the shape of our handwriting, and I think that's really important, and I think that really emphasizes the nature of your 4Es, the understanding there that actually there is a relationship. It is very you know, kind of close. There is a flat ontology. It is a shared co-creative or collaborative way forward. And I think the 4Es can help us understand those notions about what's going on with our extendedness, embeddedness, you know, the distributed cognition of it all. And
Yes.
why do you bring that up as a point?
So in general, or you?
No, you mentioned, you highlighted the here and now, and there's something in that. Do you see something in your understanding of the 4Es that this takes us beyond the state of the art?
Yes, I think that this somehow emphasizes again the way in which we can really create relationships with the world that go bidirectionally, so that we take in and take into, to use your own words from the book, meaning, and musical meaning can be enacted in different ways with technology, with others, and this is also something that, in my opinion, goes also beyond purely solipsistic views of music making. Digital scores really promote social inclusion in a nice way, and I think the fact that the here and now engagement is now much more extended from a temporal perspective and from a social perspective as well, that really kind of gives us a sort of novel, a richer way of looking at music and music making that can, you know, give us novel tools to reflect upon and look at music from different perspectives. There is also another aspect that perhaps we could talk about, but I think we already went through our time.
No, we've got 5 or so minutes still to go before it's 30 minutes.
No, I mean, I think that with regard to education, again, this idea, I mean, we could discuss about the role of technologies in general, but also about the role of online and remote learning. I think that in a way, this to kind of follow up on the previous discussion, this also could provide a more in a way, a more democratic way to think of education, because sometimes the costs, I mean, to speak very practically, this cost associated with learning tuition are very high. Sometimes people live in places where they could not afford to go to a music teacher, to a music school, and I think it is really important now with the you know, the global how technologies now permeates the world, to kind of recognize also this specific aspect of digital technologies that can really make people closer to each other and can help also people who maybe cannot afford to learn music in a traditional way to have novel tools to engage with musical activities. And I find this very, you know, noble and lovely aspect of digital technologies. What do you think about it, Craig?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, and that's kind of at the heart of the values that I'm wanting to bring into the ERC project as well. You know, is to be able to reach out and help, but also as well to provide a theoretical framework with which we can really understand where meaning and value and transformation and learning can happen. because I think we're dealing with different set of signatures from what a traditional common notated score is. I don't think it's a different thing. I don't think we need to use the P word. It's not a different paradigm yet. I think it's a stepping stone, but it does come with its own signatures and its own priorities and its own wants and needs. And because of that, we need to reshape the theoretical understanding of it and getting into the heart of what's going on inside the flow of musicking. And this is where I think your 4Es, Andrea, they have always inspired me ever since my PhD. When we were both dabbling with that a decade or so ago. For me that exposes out that inner dimension that happens, and that for me is truly where meaning and the relationship happen, and that reinforces Christopher Small's notion of musicking as well. And also as well, I think, having written the book and paid some attention to the traditional paper score, actually by viewing the digital score from this transdisciplinary and mixed media theorist and phenomenology approach, actually we can go back and revisit the piece of paper, and we can perhaps look at it anew or afresh, or understand really what's going on in there. Again, what Small says, what's going on here,
Yes, I fully agree with you.
My last question to you was, is there anything else that you wanted to say? But actually, you've already kind of launched into a really interesting, kind of avenue where it's very rich food for thought. So as we've come to kind of the end of the 30 minutes, I will offer you that question. Is there anything that you would like to contribute or to say or to incite or to inspire just before we close down?
Yeah, I just wanted to thank you, Craig, for giving me an opportunity to read and reflect on your book. It was a really nice journey for me. I trained as a composer myself, but I never had the chance to kind of reflect deeply on the nature of digital scores or to engage with digital scores. So it was a really nice opportunity for me to do so. So thank you very much for this and for the nice chat we had now.
My pleasure, Andrea, and hopefully we'll get to see each other in person. Thank you. Very much. Let's close it there. So.